The night Grant Holloway finally embarrassed me in public, the room went quiet in a way I'd never heard before. Not awkward, quiet, not polite silence. It was the kind that falls when people sense something irreversible has just happened. We were standing in a penthouse living room on Fifth Avenue, glass walls framing the Manhattan skyline like it belonged to him. His colleagues circled with champagne flutes, laughing too loudly, dressed in confidence and tailored suits. I stood beside Grant with a practiced smile, one hand wrapped around a glass I hadn't touched, the other resting still, as if movement itself might expose me. Someone asked what I did. Grant didn't even look at me when he answered. "She doesn't work," he said, amused. "She's just a housewife." The word just landed hard. A few people chuckled. One woman tilted her head with pity she tried to hide. Another man nodded, as if Grant had explained an inconvenience instead of a human being. No one corrected him. No one asked what I gave up. No one wondered why the house was always perfect, or why his suits were always pressed, or why his life ran so smoothly. Grant finally glanced at me then, expecting gratitude for the honesty. His smile was relaxed, careless. He had already decided what I was worth. I felt my chest tighten, but I didn't speak. I had learned something important during our marriage. Reacting only gave him power. Silence, on the other hand, made people underestimate you. Inside, something shifted. I watched him that night, how he soaked in approval, how easily he believed the room belonged to him. I memorized the sound of his voice when he laughed at my expense. I memorized the faces of people who didn't defend me, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. Because in that moment, I understood something Grant never would. This wasn't the end of me. It was the last time I would ever let him define me. And as the city lights reflected in the glass around us, I made a promise to myself. One that would take 3 years to fulfill, and only one meeting to make him regret. He thought this was my lowest point. He had no idea it was the beginning of his downfall. By the time we got home that night, Grant was in a good mood. That was always the cruelest part. When he felt powerful, he became generous, with words that sounded kind, but landed like rules. He loosened his tie, dropped his Mont Blanc pen onto the marble kitchen counter, and poured himself a drink as if the penthouse were a reward he'd earned alone. I followed quietly, already bracing for the familiar shift in the air. "You should have spoken up," he said casually. "People might have thought I was exaggerating." I looked at him. "About what?" He shrugged. "That you don't work. It's not an insult, Natalie. It's just reality." Reality. His favorite word. Grant loved words that sounded objective, like facts no one was allowed to argue with. I wanted to remind him that I had worked once, that I'd given up my job when his career took off, that the move to Manhattan, the long hours, the networking dinners, the image of the perfect executive wife, none of it happened by accident. But I'd learned those conversations never ended well. He didn't hear explanations. He heard threats. Instead, I asked the question I already knew the answer to. "Can I have access to the savings account?" I said. "Just for groceries and school expenses." Grant paused, glass halfway to his mouth. Then he smiled, tight, controlled. "Why would you need that?" he asked. "I take care of everything." That was how he said no without saying no. He controlled the money, the calendar, even the tone of our conversations. My credit cards had limits I didn't set. My name wasn't on the investment accounts. When I mentioned taking a course online, he laughed and told me to enjoy my free time while I had it. "You don't need stress," he said. "That's my job." What he meant was, you don't need independence. Later that night, after he fell asleep, I sat at the edge of the bed and stared at the city lights through the window. My phone buzzed, an alert that a payment I'd made earlier had been declined. Again. I didn't cry. I opened my laptop instead, careful not to wake him, and started listing everything I didn't control. Money, time, choices. And then, quietly, I started listing the things he'd forgotten I still had. My mind, my patience, my memory. Grant thought control was power. He had no idea he was teaching me exactly what to take back. I didn't catch Grant cheating the way people imagine it happens. There was no lipstick on a collar, no late-night confession, no dramatic scene that could be pointed to as proof. What I found was quieter, and somehow more humiliating. It started with his phone. Grant never guarded it. He didn't think he had to. One evening, while he was in the shower, his screen lit up on the nightstand with a message preview. Just one line. "Can't wait to see you again." Tonight was easy. No hearts, no explicit words, nothing that could stand up in court or silence an argument. Just familiarity, intimacy without evidence. I didn't open the message. I didn't need to. From that moment on, patterns appeared everywhere. The way he smiled at his phone, then locked it when I entered the room. The new cologne he claimed was for meetings. The sudden interest in networking events that didn't include spouses. He stopped asking about dinner and started coming home already full. Once, while folding his jacket, I noticed a faint scent that didn't belong to our home. Not perfume exactly. Something clean, confident, something chosen. "New client?" I asked lightly. He didn't even hesitate. "PR consultant, Vanessa Cole. She's good at what she does." The name settled in my chest like a stone. I didn't confront him, not because I was weak, but because I was paying attention. I watched how he spoke about her, always professionally, always just enough. I watched how he grew impatient with me in ways he never used to. I watched how the space between us filled with things unsaid. One night, I asked, "Are you still happy with me?" Grant looked genuinely confused. Why wouldn't I be? That was the answer. He didn't see what he was doing as betrayal. To him, it was entitlement. He worked hard. He deserved admiration. And I, quiet, unpaid, invisible, no longer fit the version of himself he wanted reflected back. That was when I understood something crucial. I didn't need proof. I didn't need him to admit anything. The affair wasn't in his body. It was in his respect, and that was already gone. So I made my decision quietly, the same way everything important in my life had begun to happen. I would leave without accusations, without begging, without a scene he could twist into a story where I was emotional and unreasonable. I would leave him exactly what he believed I was worth. Nothing. Grant thought betrayal required a confession. He never realized silence was my way out and my way forward. The day Grant took our son wasn't loud. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, no dramatic confrontation. That came later, in courtrooms and paperwork. What stayed with me was how ordinary it looked. Grant stood in the living room, already dressed for work, his jacket perfectly pressed. Our son sat on the couch with his backpack at his feet, swinging his legs, while unaware that his life was being divided into before and after. "This is temporary," Grant said, adjusting his cufflinks, "until things settle." I asked him what things. He didn't answer that. He knelt in front of our son instead, smoothing his hair, smiling the smile people saved for witnesses. "Daddy's taking you for a bit, okay? Just until Mommy figures things out." Figures things out. As if I were a problem that needed correcting. The lawyer's words echoed in my head later that afternoon. Phrases like financial stability, primary residence, best interests. Grant's income spoke louder than my history. My years at home didn't count as contribution. My sacrifices didn't show up on statements. I watched from the doorway as they left. Our son turned back once, confused, and waved. I waved too, enforcing a smile that cracked the moment the elevator doors closed. The apartment felt hollow after that. Too quiet. I sat on the floor for a long time, my back against the wall, staring at a toy car he'd forgotten under the table. That was when the shaking started. Not sobbing, not panic. Just a deep, physical tremor that came from realizing how easily everything could be taken when your name wasn't on the right documents. That night, Grant texted me. "He's fine. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I read it 3 times. Harder for who? I wanted to scream. I wanted to beg. I wanted to remind him of bedtime stories, of scraped knees, of mornings I handled alone so he could leave early and look important. Instead, I placed my phone face down and sat in the dark until the city lights outside flickered on. Something inside me broke then, but not in the way people expect. The fear burned away first. The desperation followed. What remained was sharp, steady, and painfully clear. If money and power were the language Grant understood, then that was the language I would learn to speak fluently. Because the next time my son looked for me, I would be standing where no one could push me aside again. Grant believed taking my child would end me. He never understood it was the moment I stopped being afraid. The apartment in Queens smelled faintly of old paint and burned coffee. It was on the 3rd floor of a walk-up building with uneven steps and a radiator that knocked all night like it had something to complain about. The first morning I woke up there, sunlight pushed through cheap blinds and landed on the bare floor, revealing just how empty the place really was. One mattress, one folding table, 2 chairs that didn't match. I stood in the middle of the room, holding a paper cup of coffee I'd bought from a corner bodega because I didn't own a coffee maker yet. The cup was too hot, the lid loose. It fit my life perfectly. This was the first space I'd lived in that no one else had chosen for me. I took a job that week, answering phones for a logistics company in Long Island City. The pay was low, the hours long, and the desk wobbled if I leaned on it too hard. No one cared where I'd been before. No one asked about my marriage. To them, I was just another woman grateful for a paycheck. At night, I walked home past laundromats and flickering storefronts, the city louder here, less polished. I learned which steps creaked, which neighbors argued, which buses ran late. I learned how to stretch groceries and how to sit with silence without it swallowing me. The hardest part wasn't the money, it was the quiet. No bedtime stories, no small shoes by the door. Just me, a borrowed laptop, and the ache of missing someone I wasn't allowed to tuck in anymore. Some nights, I pressed my palm flat against the wall and imagined my son doing the same somewhere across the city. I cried once, just once, on the bathroom floor, with the shower running so no one could hear. After that, I made rules. Every night I studied financial reports, market summaries, old notes from the life I'd paused for marriage. I highlighted mistakes other people didn't notice. I trained my mind the way some people trained their bodies, slowly, deliberately, without applause. This apartment wasn't punishment. It was insulation. Grant thought he'd reduced me to nothing. What he didn't realize was that nothing is quiet, and quiet is where focus grows. And focus, when sharpened long enough, becomes dangerous. While Grant celebrated his control downtown, I was building something he couldn't see yet, and wouldn't stop in time. My first real attempt to stand on my own didn't collapse loudly. It failed the way most dangerous things do. Quietly, with optimism attached. A woman from work introduced me to a small opportunity, a side project, short-term, low risk. She said it the way people say favors, with a smile that felt generous enough to trust. The numbers looked simple. Too simple. That should have warned me. I invested everything I had saved in 3 months, every extra hour, every skipped meal, and every subway ride where I chose to walk instead just to keep a few dollars back. I told myself this was how momentum started. This was how people like Grant built power, by taking calculated risks. I calculated wrong. 2 weeks later, the email slowed. The shared document stopped updating. When I finally called the number I'd been given, it went straight to voicemail. By the time I understood what had happened, the money was gone. Not delayed. Gone. I sat at my folding table, laptop open, refreshing my inbox like something might change if I looked long enough. Nothing did. The silence felt heavier than the loss itself. I wasn't angry yet. I was embarrassed. I had wanted this to be my proof. Proof that I wasn't just rebuilding out of spite. Proof that I was capable. Instead, it felt like confirmation of everything Grant had implied, that without him, I was reckless, naive, unqualified. That night, I didn't study. I lay on the mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening to the radiator knock its steady complaint. For the first time since I'd left, doubt crept in. Not loud enough to panic, but sharp enough to cut. What if he was right? The thought scared me more than losing the money. In the morning, I forced myself up and went to work anyway. I answered phones. I smiled when spoken to. I acted normal because survival doesn't wait for confidence to return. During my lunch break, I opened the same files that had betrayed me and read them again. Slowly this time. That was when I saw it. The mistake everyone else had missed. Not in the story they told, but in the structure underneath it. A flaw small enough to hide, and big enough to destroy anyone who didn't know where to look. My failure hadn't been meaningless. It had been instructional. I realized then that losing everything hadn't made me weaker. It had sharpened my vision. And next time, I wouldn't be the one walking away empty-handed. The mistake I found didn't look like a mistake at first. It was buried inside a spreadsheet no one questioned because the numbers appeared clean, balanced, professional. But something about the timing bothered me. The way projected returns curved too smoothly, like someone had sanded down the risk instead of removing it. I printed the file and studied it on the subway ride home, ignoring the noise around me. By the time I reached Queens, my pulse had changed. This wasn't a bad deal gone wrong. It was a structure designed to collapse quietly after siphoning value upstream. Most people wouldn't catch it. They weren't meant to. I spent the next 3 nights rebuilding the model from scratch on my borrowed laptop, cross-checking public filings, tracing shell entities, following money the way you follow footprints after snow. The deeper I went, the clearer it became. This flaw wasn't accidental. It was strategic, and it was valuable. I didn't know who to tell. I didn't have status, credentials, or an introduction. What I had was certainty. So I did the only thing available to someone invisible. I sent an email no one was supposed to read. I addressed it to Daniel Reed. His name had come up once in a conversation at work, spoken carefully, the way people talk about someone who used to matter. A former investor. Brilliant. Burned. I attached my corrected model and wrote 3 sentences explaining the risk no one was pricing in. I didn't expect a response. 2 days passed, then 3. On the 4th night, as I was closing my laptop, a notification appeared. "Can you explain page 7? My hands shook as I typed back. We spoke on the phone the next evening. Daniel didn't interrupt. He didn't test me. He listened, asked precise questions, and went quiet in a way that felt deliberate, not dismissive. At the end, he said, "You caught something my team missed." I waited for the but. It didn't come. Instead, he asked where I'd learned to see like that. I told him the truth, that I'd learned by being underestimated, by managing risk no one paid for, by watching powerful people make careless assumptions because they believed no one was looking closely. Daniel exhaled slowly. "People who survive that tend to be dangerous," he said. I smiled for the first time in weeks, because for the first time since leaving Grant, someone had seen me, not as a liability, not as a favor, but as a mind worth listening to. What I didn't know yet was that this conversation would put me directly back in Grant's orbit, on terms he never imagined. Daniel didn't offer me a job. That was the first twist. Instead, he invited me to sit in on a few meetings, off the record, unpaid, uncredited. "Just listen," he said. "See how people move when money is involved." It sounded harmless. It wasn't. That was where I met Evelyn Park. She was sharp, polished, and spoke with the calm authority of someone used to being trusted. Mid-30s, background in operations, the kind of woman who remembered names and made people feel included without ever lowering herself. She took an interest in me immediately. "You're the one who caught the variance issue," she said once, smiling. "Impressive." I wanted to believe her admiration was genuine. I needed it to be. Evelyn became my guide, explaining dynamics, introducing me carefully, warning me which rooms to avoid and which conversations to overhear. When I doubted myself, she reassured me. When I hesitated, she pushed gently. She felt like proof that this world could still hold allies. Then came the proposal, a small internal presentation. My analysis, my framework. Evelyn suggested I let her deliver it. "For optics," she said. "They don't know you yet. I do." The room was full of men who spoke quickly and listened slowly. Evelyn stood confidently at the front, my work displayed on the screen behind her. As she talked, something felt off. Not wrong, just altered. A term shifted, a risk softened, a conclusion reframed. I didn't interrupt. I told myself I was imagining it. 2 days later, the blame landed. A decision based on my model triggered concern from a partner firm. Questions followed, then doubt, then whispers. My name, attached suddenly to a mistake I hadn't made. Evelyn didn't defend me. "I think she misunderstood the scope," she said calmly. "She's still learning." The room nodded. Of course I was. Daniel called me that night. His voice was careful. "We're going to pause your involvement," he said. "Just until things settle." I hung up and sat in the dark, hands shaking, not with fear, but clarity. I pulled up the original files, compared timestamps, metadata, version histories. There it was. Evelyn hadn't stolen my work. She'd reshaped it just enough to fail and left me holding it. I didn't confront her. I didn't explain. I saved everything. Because I understood the lesson too late to stop it, but just in time to use it. In that world, betrayal didn't come from enemies. It came from people who smiled while adjusting the knife. I disappeared without announcing it. No angry emails, no explanations. No attempt to clear my name in rooms that had already decided who I was. I showed up to work, did what I was paid for, and went home. On the surface, it looked like retreat. That's what Evelyn assumed. That's what Daniel probably hoped. Silence makes people careless. While they moved on, I stayed still and watched. I rebuilt my work privately, cleaner this time, sharper, with every assumption tested twice. I tracked where Evelyn's revised model had been circulated, who benefited from its softened risks, and which firms quietly adjusted their exposure afterward. Patterns emerged when you stopped trying to defend yourself and started observing. At night, I studied contracts and governance structures the way other people scrolled through news. I learned how influence traveled without signatures, how decisions were framed before meetings even started, how mistakes were buried under urgency and confidence. No one checked on me. That was the gift. 3 weeks later, a quiet opportunity surfaced. A mid-sized fund facing internal disagreement. Nothing public, nothing urgent yet. Daniel mentioned it in passing during a call, more to think aloud than to involve me. The old me would have asked for permission. This version didn't. I ran the numbers anyway. The flaw I found wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. An assumption built on outdated data, replicated across projections without challenge. It would hold for months, maybe a year. Then it would unravel slowly, just enough to cost someone credibility. I packaged the analysis anonymously and sent it to one person on the board. No name, no context, just evidence. 2 days later, Daniel called. "Did you send something?" he asked. "Yes," I said. There was a pause, not anger, recognition. "They want to meet you," he said carefully. "Off the record." I agreed. No conditions. The meeting took place in a small conference room, no logos, no assistants. I spoke calmly, precisely, without referencing what had happened before. I didn't mention Evelyn. I didn't defend myself. I let the work speak the way it always should have. But when I finished, one man leaned back and nodded slowly. "This is what we've been missing," he said. I walked out without a title, without an offer, without applause. But something had shifted. I could feel it, not as relief, but as alignment. I wasn't fighting to be seen anymore. I was positioning myself to be undeniable. They thought my silence meant retreat. They never realized it was recalibration. 3 years after the night Grant called me just a housewife, his name was everywhere. He'd made partner. Not quietly, publicly. Industry blogs praised his instincts. His firm hosted a celebration at a rooftop venue overlooking Midtown. Glass railings glowing under string lights. The city spread beneath them like a promise fulfilled. Grant stood at the center of it all, relaxed, laughing easily. A man convinced he'd outrun every consequence. For Vanessa Cole clung to his arm that night, elegant and perfectly styled, her smile polished for cameras that weren't there, but always felt close. She laughed at his jokes a second too quickly, touched his sleeve, as if to remind everyone she belonged in this moment with him. Grant loved that. Belonging to him was proof of success. From a distance, his life looked flawless. The right woman, the right firm, the right trajectory. Even his setbacks had been smoothed over, reframed as lessons learned. Evelyn Park still moved confidently in his orbit, her own missteps buried under other people's names. What no one noticed was how often Grant checked his phone that night. He didn't know why the habit had started. A flicker of restlessness, maybe. Or instinct. Something beneath the confidence that refused to stay quiet. He scanned faces automatically, expecting recognition, validation, challenge, anything to confirm he was still ahead. He never thought to look for me. Why would he? In his mind, I had vanished into the category of people who didn't come back. Women who left quietly and stayed small. Problems he'd solved with money and timing. When someone congratulated him on handling the divorce so cleanly, Grant smiled graciously. "We both moved on," he said. "That's the important part." Moved on. The irony would have been beautiful if it hadn't been so precise. Later that night, alone for a moment near the edge of the terrace, Grant stared out at the skyline. For the first time in a long while, the view didn't calm him. The city looked crowded, competitive, alive in a way that made him feel suddenly replaceable. He shook the thought away. He had earned this. He deserved it. Across town, in a quiet office with the lights still on, I closed my laptop and checked the time. The documents had gone through. The chain was set. No signatures yet, just alignment. Grant was celebrating the peak of his power. He had no idea he was standing on the edge of it, because the higher he climbed, the harder the fall would be, and I was already positioned beneath the landing. The invitation didn't come with my name on it. That was intentional. Daniel called me early one morning, his voice low, careful. "There's a situation," he said. "A firm looking to restructure quietly. No press, no announcements. They want outside perspective, someone who isn't carrying old loyalties." I asked who else was involved. He paused. "People you know," he said, "and one you used to." That was how I knew Grant was somewhere nearby. The meeting was held in a neutral office downtown, the kind with blank walls and no branding, designed to make power feel abstract, negotiable. I arrived early, dressed simply, carrying nothing but a slim folder and a calm I hadn't felt in years. No one introduced me as anything. Not analyst, not consultant, certainly not CEO. I was additional insight, brought in because someone had read something that made them uncomfortable. They started with pleasantries, market conditions, risk appetite. Grant spoke confidently, as expected, his voice steady, his arguments smooth. He didn't look at me once. To him, I was background, someone's assistant maybe, someone temporary. When it was my turn, I didn't counter him directly. I asked questions, small ones, clarifying ones, questions that forced definitions instead of opinions. I watched as assumptions hardened into statements, then cracked under their own weight. I introduced data slowly, never framing it as opposition, just context. The room shifted. People leaned forward. Pens stopped moving. Grant's tone changed, not defensive yet, but sharper. He adjusted, tried to regain control of the narrative. But once momentum moves away from you, chasing it only makes the loss visible. At one point, a board member turned to me and asked, "If this is true, how would you restructure?" I answered without hesitation. Not because I'd rehearsed, but because I'd already built the alternative months ago, in silence, without permission. The meeting ended without decisions. That was the tell. Afterward, in the hallway, Daniel caught my eye. He didn't smile. He nodded. Once. That night, an email arrived from an unfamiliar address. "We'd like to continue this conversation. Privately. No titles. No hierarchy. Just interest." For the first time, I wasn't reacting to Grant's world. I was shaping one that overlapped it, and would soon eclipse it. Real power, I realized, doesn't announce itself. It waits until resistance has nowhere left to stand. The announcement went public on a Tuesday morning, buried beneath market updates and earnings forecasts. quiet enough to avoid spectacle, loud enough to reach the right people. Daniel forwarded me the link with no message. I read it once, then again. Interim leadership appointed. Restructuring committee formed. Natalie Brooks named Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. No photo, no quotes. Just facts. I sat at my desk in the small office I'd been using temporarily and let the words settle. CEO, not advisor, not consultant, not interim analyst filling space. The responsibility landed first, not pride, not relief. Responsibility for decisions that would ripple through other people's lives the way Grant's choices once rippled through mine. By noon, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Some messages were congratulatory, others cautious, a few thinly veiled attempts to claim familiarity that had never existed. I responded to none of them. Power announces itself best through consistency, not celebration. Across town, Grant found out the same way everyone else did. An associate mentioned it casually in a meeting, scrolling through updates on a tablet. "Did you see this?" he asked. "New CEO appointment. Interesting background." Grant leaned over, I'm barely listening. Then he saw the name. For a moment, the room continued around him, voices overlapping, chairs shifting, coffee being poured. He heard none of it. The only sound was the sudden rush of memory, sharp and unwelcome. Natalie Brooks. He laughed once, too quickly. "That can't be right," he said. "There must be another one." But there wasn't. He clicked the link himself, reading every line as if something might change if he looked hard enough. It didn't. The words stayed where they were, indifferent to his disbelief. That afternoon, I walked into the boardroom for the first time as CEO, floor-to-ceiling glass. Manhattan stretched beneath us, sharp and bright. People stood when I entered, not out of habit but recognition. I didn't mention Grant. I didn't need to. Our paths were about to cross again, not as husband and wife, not even as equals, but as decision-maker and consequence. And as I took my seat at the head of the table, I understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't revenge. This was return. Grant once decided my worth without asking. Now, every move he made would require my approval. Grant didn't know I would be in the room. That was the first crack. He arrived 10 minutes early, confident as ever, briefcase in hand, posture relaxed. The posture of a man used to entering spaces that bent slightly in his favor. He nodded at familiar faces, exchanged quiet jokes, took the seat he always took near the center of the table. He never looked toward the head. The boardroom filled slowly, glass walls, soft hum of the city below. The kind of room where decisions didn't sound dramatic but changed lives anyway. Grant reviewed his notes. I already planning how to steer the conversation, how to assert relevance under the new leadership. Then the door opened. I walked in without pause, without announcement. Not rushed, not cautious, just present. Chairs shifted. Conversations stopped. A few people stood instinctively. Grant didn't, not at first. He looked up when the silence stretched too long, irritation flickering across his face, until his eyes landed on me. The color drained from him so fast, it was almost clinical. For a moment, he didn't recognize me as anything but disruption. Then recognition hit, sharp and undeniable. His mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but nothing came out. No words fit the space where certainty used to be. I didn't look away. I took my seat at the head of the table and placed my folder down, aligning it carefully with the edge. The gesture was small, deliberate, control, not confrontation. "Good morning," I said evenly. "Thank you for being on time." My voice didn't shake. I'd practiced that, not in front of a mirror, but in moments when silence had been my only protection. Grant stared, frozen between disbelief and calculation. I could see the thoughts racing. How this was possible, who had allowed it, how quickly he could reframe this into something manageable. He tried to smile. It didn't reach his eyes. "Natalie," he said cautiously. "I didn't realize you didn't need to," I replied. Calm, professional, final. "Let's begin." The agenda moved forward. Numbers, strategy, risks. Grant spoke when invited, more carefully now. his confidence dulled by uncertainty. Each time he glanced at me, it was with the same unspoken question. How? I didn't answer it, because the truth was already doing the work. As the meeting progressed, Grant understood something no one needed to explain. This room no longer belonged to him, and for the first time since I'd known him, he wasn't in control of the outcome. He had spent years deciding who mattered. Now he was waiting to find out if he still did. Grant expected a confrontation. I could see it in the way he held himself, shoulders squared, jaw set, ready to defend against something loud and emotional. He'd rehearsed apologies in case I wanted them, arguments in case I accused him, charm in case I tried to humiliate him back. I did none of that. I didn't bring up our marriage. I didn't reference the past. I didn't even look at him longer than necessary. Instead, I asked questions. "Can you clarify the assumption behind this projection?" I said, my tone neutral, almost curious. Grant answered smoothly at first, relieved. This was familiar territory. Numbers, confidence, authority. He spoke the way he always had, filling space with certainty. Heads around the table nodded. Pens moved. Then I asked another question, smaller, more specific. "And this risk exposure, how was it stress-tested under reduced liquidity?" Grant paused, just a beat too long. He adjusted, reframed, tried again. The answer sounded reasonable, but it leaned on an assumption I knew was false. I didn't correct him. I simply followed up. "So if the timing shifts by even 1/4, what absorbs the impact?" Silence. Not dramatic, not explosive, just enough. Someone else leaned in. Another board member flipped a page. Grant's confidence thinned, replaced by precision that bordered on defensive. Each response narrowed his options. Each clarification boxed him closer to the truth he'd hoped would stay abstract. I watched carefully, not with satisfaction, but focus. This wasn't personal. This was structural. Finally, I said it, not as accusation, not as triumph. "This model relies on conditions that no longer exist," I said. "If we proceed as planned, the downside won't appear immediately. But when it does, it will be irreversible." No raised voice, no pause for effect, just fact. Grant opened his mouth, then closed it. He knew it. The room knew it. He had walked himself there, step by step, answering questions he couldn't retreat from without exposing more than he could afford. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. "Let's table this," I continued. "We'll reconvene after revising the assumptions." The meeting moved on. Grant said little after that. When he did speak, it was carefully, cautiously, stripped of the ease he once wore like armor. As people filed out, he stayed seated, staring at the table, as if it might explain what had happened. I gathered my papers and stood. This wasn't revenge. It was competence meeting accountability. Grant came in expecting judgment. He left, realizing he'd been measured, and found wanting. The custody review was scheduled for the following week, quietly added to my calendar between board briefings and risk assessments. No headlines, no observers, just a small courtroom and a judge who believed truth revealed itself best when no one performed. Grant arrived confident again, less polished than before, but composed. He wore the same controlled expression he'd used in the boardroom, the one that said he was adapting, on not losing. His attorney spoke first, citing stability, resources, routine, the language of advantage. Then it was my turn. I spoke briefly, about schedules, about support, about showing up. I didn't mention money. I didn't mention power. I focused on what mattered because I knew what was coming next. The judge asked if our son wanted to say anything. Grant stiffened. I felt my breath catch, but I didn't stop it. Our son walked forward slowly, hands tucked into the sleeves of his sweatshirt. He was small for his age, still carrying the careful seriousness of a child who'd learned early that adults didn't always mean what they said. The judge knelt to his level. "You don't have to say anything you don't want to," she said gently. He nodded. Then he spoke. "I like being with Dad," he said, glancing briefly at Grant. Grant's shoulders relaxed. "But when I'm with Mom, she listens." The room went quiet. "She helps me with homework," he continued, "even when she's tired. and she doesn't get mad when I ask questions. Grant's smile faltered. The judge waited. And when I'm scared at night, my son said softly, Mom stays until I fall asleep, even if she has to wake up early. No accusations, no blame, just truth. Unfiltered, untrained, devastatingly simple. Grant opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing to counter. No argument that could diminish care without revealing something ugly underneath. The judge nodded once and thanked him. As our son returned to his seat beside me, he reached for my hand. I squeezed it gently, steadying us both. Grant stared forward, jaw tight, eyes unfocused. For the first time, when he wasn't being evaluated by numbers or outcomes, he was being seen, and not by me. That day, power shifted without a ruling, and Grant understood that no amount of control could rewrite a child's truth. The collapse didn't happen all at once. That would have been too merciful. It began with delays. Grant's revised proposal stalled in committee, then bounced back with requests for additional verification. Partners who used to return his calls within minutes started replying hours later. Then not at all. Meetings were rescheduled, then quietly reassigned. Influence doesn't disappear. It thins. At the firm, questions followed him like a shadow. Not accusations, those came later. But curiosity sharpened into concern. Why had his projections required revision so suddenly? Well, why were counterparties asking for guarantees that hadn't been necessary before? Grant worked longer hours, trying to outrun the doubt. He stayed late, sent follow-up emails, volunteered for damage control. But effort couldn't fix what had already been seen. One afternoon, he was called into a conference room without warning. No celebration, no small talk. Just 3 senior partners and a legal advisor. They spoke calmly, professionally. They referenced timelines, exposure, fiduciary responsibility. The words weren't harsh, but they were final. Grant was being removed from leadership on the restructuring deal, effective immediately. His role would be reassessed once internal reviews concluded. Reassessed was the word they used when trust had cracked. Grant nodded as if he understood. He even thanked them. The pride doesn't break loudly. It tightens, hoping to hold shape. Outside the room, his phone buzzed. Vanessa. Is everything okay? She asked. He didn't answer. By evening, rumors had found their way into the open. Not gossip. Analysis. The kind that spreads quietly through offices and industry chats, stripped of emotion. Grant's name appeared less frequently, then differently. Cautiously. Vanessa noticed the shift immediately. That weekend she canceled plans, claimed work, then distance. When he pressed, she deflected. When he pushed, she grew cold. You've been distracted, she said. I need stability. The irony would have been laughable if it hadn't been so precise. By Monday, she was gone. Grant sat alone in his apartment, scrolling through messages that had stopped arriving. For the first time, there was no one to reassure him that this was temporary, that he was still ahead. Across the city, I signed off on a report and closed my laptop. Grant's downfall wasn't caused by me. It was caused by everything he'd ignored. Every assumption, every shortcut, every moment he believed power made him untouchable. He thought losing me had no cost. Now, he was finally paying it, with interest. The ruling came on a Thursday afternoon, delivered without ceremony. No speech, no gavel slam, just a measured explanation of what the court had considered, what it had weighed, and what it had decided. Stability, consistency, emotional presence. The words mattered less than the pattern they formed. Primary custody was awarded to me, not as punishment to Grant, not as reward for me, as correction. I felt it first in my hands, a sudden warmth, a loosening I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for years. When the judge finished speaking, I nodded once, professional even in relief. I had learned that composure carried weight in rooms where emotion was often dismissed. Grant sat very still. His attorney leaned in to whisper something, but Grant didn't respond. His eyes were fixed ahead, unfocused, as if he were trying to understand how something so quiet could undo what he'd controlled so carefully. Outside the courtroom, he stopped me. "Natalie," he said, voice lower than I remembered. Not angry. Not pleading. Just tired. I turned. "I didn't think it would go this way," he admitted. "I thought—" He stopped himself. Thought better of finishing. I waited. Silence had taught me patience. "You always said you wanted fairness," he continued. "I guess this is it." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't accountability. But it was the closest Grant had ever come to acknowledging something beyond himself. "I wanted our son safe," I said. "That's all." He nodded once. That night, my son slept in his own bed again. Not a borrowed room. Not a schedule divided by handoffs and conditions. I sat beside him as he drifted off, his breathing steady, his hand wrapped loosely around mine. "Mom," he murmured. "Yes." "You're not sad anymore," he said, not asking. I smiled. "I'm okay," I told him. And for the first time, it was completely true. Later, alone in the living room, I reviewed documents for work, but my focus kept returning to something quieter. Not victory, not triumph. Balance. Grant had lost what he thought defined him. I had regained what mattered most. Justice hadn't arrived as revenge. It arrived as alignment. Slow, firm, and impossible to argue with once it was in place. For years, Grant used power to take. That day, the law used clarity to give back. Vanessa didn't leave Grant the way she'd entered his life. There was no confrontation, no dramatic exit, no final message meant to hurt him. She simply stopped answering. At first, Grant assumed she was busy. That was always the easiest explanation. Then he noticed the subtler signs. The unanswered calls, the delayed replies, the sudden absence from the places she used to appear effortlessly. When he finally reached her, days later, her voice was polite, distant. "I think we should take some space," she said, as if suggesting a rescheduled lunch. "Things are complicated right now." Complicated meant inconvenient. Grant tried to explain. The reviews were temporary. The firm was being cautious, and his name still carried weight. He just needed time. Vanessa listened without interrupting, then sighed softly. "I'm at a point in my life where I need clarity," she said, "and stability." Grant recognized the words. He'd used them himself once, on me. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means I can't afford uncertainty," she replied. "And right now, you're full of it." She ended the call gently, as if there were nothing left to discuss. The truth settled slowly. Vanessa hadn't loved him. She'd loved the version of him that walked into rooms already admired. The moment that version cracked, her interest evaporated. That was the agreement he'd never questioned. Attention in exchange for security. Now he had neither. In the weeks that followed, Vanessa's name appeared elsewhere. New events, new company, a different arm to hold at carefully chosen gatherings. She hadn't fallen. She'd transitioned. That was her talent. Grant watched from a distance, scrolling through images he wasn't meant to see. For the first time, the absence felt heavier than betrayal. It wasn't anger he felt. It was disposability. Across the city, I heard about Vanessa only in passing. A brief mention, a footnote. She no longer occupied any emotional space in my life, and I found that strangely satisfying. Because her punishment wasn't humiliation. It was irrelevance. Vanessa had built her worth on proximity to power. When the power shifted, so did she. Without loyalty, without consequence, without reflection. That was her cycle. Grant had chosen her thinking she was an upgrade. Now he understood what she had always been. A mirror that only reflected success, and shattered at the first sign of failure. In the end, Vanessa lost nothing she truly valued, and that, too, was its own kind of emptiness. Healing didn't arrive as a single moment. It unfolded quietly in ordinary places, when no one was watching. It showed up one morning as I packed my son's lunch without rushing, realizing I no longer checked the clock with dread. It appeared in the evenings, when work emails could wait because bedtime stories mattered more. It lived in the space where fear used to sit. Alexander Vaughn entered my life without announcement. No grand gesture, no rescue. He was already there, present at meetings, attentive without intrusion, listening more than speaking. He never asked about my past directly. He paid attention to what I chose to reveal, and he respected the rest. Our conversations began with work, strategy, responsibility, the weight of decisions that didn't fit neatly into spreadsheets. He challenged me, but never diminished me. When we disagreed, he didn't assert dominance. He explored reasoning. That was new. One evening, after a long day, we walked through the city without agenda. The air was cool, the streets steady with motion. He asked me a simple question. "Are you tired?" he said. "Or are you finally resting?" I didn't answer right away. "I'm resting," I said, finally, and meant it. Alexander didn't offer promises. He offered consistency. He showed up when he said he would. He remembered details that weren't strategic. He treated my son, not as an extension of me, but as a person with his own gravity. The first time my son laughed freely around him, I felt something loosen in my chest. Trust, I realized, wasn't built by intensity. It was built by safety. When Alexander asked me to marry him, it wasn't during a celebration or a victory. It was at home, in a quiet moment, when life felt balanced rather than impressive. "I don't need you to choose me," he said. "I want you to want me." I said yes, not because I needed a partner, but because I recognized one. This marriage wasn't compensation for what I'd endured. It wasn't proof of worth or closure or triumph. It was a choice, a reward not granted by fate or justice, but earned through survival, clarity, and growth. Grant had once believed I would always be defined by what I lost. He never understood that what I gained would be far greater. I didn't just rebuild my life. I reclaimed the right to choose it, on my own terms. On the evening everything finally felt complete. I stood by the window and watched the Manhattan skyline fade into dusk. The city didn't look victorious or cruel anymore. It simply existed, steady, vast, indifferent to who rose or fell within it. That used to frighten me. Now it felt honest. Alexander was in the kitchen, helping my son with a school project, their voices low and focused. Not forced, not careful, just present. I listened for a moment, then turned back to the glass, seeing my reflection layered over the city lights. I barely recognized the woman I used to be, the one who measured her worth by someone else's approval, who mistook silence for safety, who believed endurance was the same as strength. Strength, I had learned, wasn't quiet suffering. It was deliberate choice. Grant crossed my mind then, not with anger or satisfaction, but distance, and I didn't need to imagine where he was or what he'd lost. His story no longer ran parallel to mine. It had diverged the moment I stopped reacting and started building. That was the real ending. Not his fall, not my rise, but the separation of paths. Later, my son tugged at my sleeve. "Mom," he said, looking up at me, "are you happy?" The question was simple, honest, unburdened by context. "Yes," I said, "I am." And the answer didn't require explanation. That night, after the apartment grew quiet, I opened a notebook I'd kept for years, the one filled with lists of what I didn't have, what I couldn't control, what I feared losing. I read the first page, then the last. The transformation wasn't dramatic on paper, but it was total. I closed the notebook and set it aside. Some records are meant to be kept, others are meant to be released. And I hadn't won a war. I hadn't proven anyone wrong out loud. I hadn't taken revenge. What I had done was far more lasting. I had reclaimed my agency. I had protected my child. I had built a life that didn't require permission. Grant once looked down on me, certain I would stay where he left me. 3 years later, I didn't decide his fate. I simply outgrew the need to care about it. Because the greatest justice isn't watching someone fall. It's standing so firmly in your own life that their fall no longer matters. So, the story has come to an end. And if you're still here with us right now, really still here until this moment, then something in this journey must have touched your heart in a quiet, personal way. Maybe it reminded you of a time you were underestimated. Maybe of a season when you stayed silent just to survive. Or maybe it showed you that real strength doesn't arrive with noise or revenge, but with clarity and choice. As the Stoics taught us, You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. This story wasn't about winning against someone else. It was about reclaiming yourself, about understanding, as Marcus Aurelius wrote, that the best revenge is not to be like your enemy. Healing doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like setting boundaries. Sometimes it looks like choosing peace. Sometimes it looks like quietly building a life that no longer needs permission. And if any part of that resonates with you, then you're not alone. We're walking this path together. If this story spoke to you, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that heal, remind, and empower. Thank you for being here. Truly. Before we close, we'd like to gently clarify something important for our viewers. This story is a work of fiction, created for storytelling and emotional reflection. While the characters, events, and situations may feel real and relatable, they are not intended to represent any specific individual, company, or real-life case. The purpose of this story is to explore universal human experiences, resilience, personal growth, accountability, and healing through a narrative lens. Any similarities to real people or events are purely coincidental. We encourage viewers to see this as a symbolic journey rather than a factual account. Stories like this are meant to inspire thought, empathy, and self-reflection, and not to provide legal, financial, or personal advice. Thank you for understanding and for engaging with this content in the spirit it was created, one of insight, learning, and emotional connection.